let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
What up, what up? This is your boy Rob Clark, welcoming you to the 22 November Network. Get ready for another exciting edition of the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring me, that's right, your boy Rob Clark, coming at you. Stay tuned. Be right there. What's up, everybody? This is Rob Clark here on the Lone Gunman Podcast, episode number 55. Today I have a very special guest joining me, and I have not talked to him before, but for those of you out there in the Facebook world, hopefully you've heard of him. His name is Charles Cliff. Welcome, Charles, to the show. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well, Rob. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, no problem at all. No problem at all. And I wanted to have you on today because we share a lot of common interest in the JFK community and with research, and wanted to talk to you a little bit today about the Garrison investigation. But first,
I can talk for a long time about that, so
well, let's do it, brother.
That's not a problem.
All right. But first, just tell everybody a little bit about yourself, maybe how you got interested in the assassination, and just a little background on you there, Charles, for those that aren't familiar.
All right. Well, I'm coming from Vancouver, BC, Canada, home of the Canucks. That could be a good or bad thing, depending on who you are. My interest in the case actually came when I was rather young. I was about 10 years old, back around 1988, and my mom and my sister were really involved in watching a lot of the documentaries that were on TV for the 25th anniversary of the assassination, which would have been in 88, and there were just times where I would just sat down and just started watching them with them, and the more and more I watched, the more and more interested I got in the case. And then in 91, Oliver Stone came out with his movie JFK, and probably since that time I've watched it about 300 times. I watch it constantly. And as I went in through my teenage years, I started reading books. The first book I ever read was Crossfire by Jim Mars. Oh, yeah. And I was finding them out at the library. I was buying them in the bookstores. Who buys books at bookstores anymore? But I just started going there, and then with the advent of social media and Facebook, I just started going on to groups, and obviously there's a lot of people out there that are interested in the same topic as I am, so I just got into discussions, and about 2.5 years ago, I was invited by Brian Haskins, who was the administrator of the JFK Assassination Research Bureau, which is a Facebook research and discussion group, to be one of his fellow admins, and I've been admitting there for the last 2.5 years, along with being involved in some other discussion groups as well.
Cool, yeah. I mean, your story sounds a lot like mine. We first became interested in the case at about the same time, I'd probably say. Like I said, right around 87, 88. I had to do a paper on John F. Kennedy, write basically a biography report, and I was totally oblivious to everything. I had heard, of course, that Oswald had shot him, and believed that because I didn't hear anything otherwise. But So I went to the library and I started looking up, how we had to do it back in the old days with the card catalog.
Yeah.
And then
that was very convenient.
Yeah, and then you had to actually go into the library and find the book that you're looking for using the, I forget what the Dewey Decimal System, I think it was called.
Yeah.
I mean, these kids today don't know how good they have it, Charles, with, the
Go
internet.
to Google and type something in. There you go.
Oh, my God. But, yeah, so, I'd go get these books, and I stumbled across a book by Jim Garrison called On the Trail of the Assassins. And I read that, and I was like, holy shit. This is not what I've been taught. And after reading that, and I did my report and all that, I just kept on reading. It was something that interested me. And then, like you said, JFK came out, and I was like, yep, here we go. And, of course, there was a big onslaught, around 92 with the JFK Records Act and the ARRB. And, like I said, ever since then, I've been interested, probably read hundreds of books about it. But enough about me. Let's get back to you, my friend.
Alrighty.
So, yeah, let's get down to nuts and bolts about the Garrison investigation, because a lot of people tend to, and I'm a little biased because I run a Garrison group on Facebook, but a lot of people in other groups, you never, ever see mention at all the Garrison investigation. And, Jim Garrison was, I believe, a great man who stood by his convictions and tried to do the right thing. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to get the results that he so desired. But, he left us a great wealth of knowledge that we normally wouldn't have had if it hadn't been for his investigation.
That's right. And like I say, no matter what you think of Garrison or what you think of Clay Shaw and regarding his guilt or innocence, just the mere information we got from that investigation alone is worth giving Jim Garrison, commending Jim Garrison, because if he doesn't launch that investigation, there's probably still a bunch of stuff there that's hidden, and maybe we don't know even half of what we know today.
Exactly. I mean, without... And I was trying to think earlier today, Charles, about what triggered the, I guess it was the sudden interest. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was the day after the assassination or a couple of days after. Exactly what was the catalyst for the interest in David Ferrie in New Orleans?
Well, what had happened is Garrison was, like the rest of the country that day, watching the endless news reports from, the news networks about the assassination about Oswald, and then he learned the tidbit that Oswald had, the previous summer, been living in New Orleans. So, at that point, being like any DA would, he would talk to people, talk to his men, and try and find out, who was this guy associating with, and or any sort of connection to his city. Being that he's the DA of New Orleans, he's something he's going to want to find out. So he had his men out about going around and talking to many of the people out in the New Orleans area and trying to find associates of his day. And a couple people, in particular Jack Martin, who worked out of Guy Bannister's office, we'll get to, who these guys were, said that he had seen Oswald in Guy Bannister's office, and he was with David Ferrie. And according to Garrison, a couple of his other investigators had also found people that said they saw Oswald together with Ferrie. And also, he got a tip, or one of his investigators, Herbert Coleman, got a tip that David Ferrie, on the afternoon of the assassination, had gone on a trip to Texas. So at that point, Garrison figures, well, I should probably bring him in and start talking to him. So Garrison brought him in and questioned him. And after questioning him, he thought, you know what, something's not adding up with his story. I'm going to turn him over and have the FBI question him.
Right.
So he turns Ferrie over to the FBI. The FBI questions him, and they say, no, there's no connection to the assassination for David Ferrie. Garrison was a former FBI man himself, so he figured, okay, they've done their job, so there's nothing there, and didn't bother pursuing it any further. So that's kind of what got started on the investigation, and it wasn't until several years later that he got back into interest in it, probably around 1966, when, well, there's actually conflicting stories about what rekindled his interest. The popular one, the one that's shown in the movie JFK, shows him having a conversation with New Orleans Senator Russell Long. Mm-hmm. And Russell Long, they're sitting on an airplane, the assassination came up, and Russell Long said, you know what, he didn't buy the Warren Commission. He didn't believe it. And I believe the phrase he is reported to use is, that dog don't hunt. And if you're down in the South and you're into hunting at all, you'll know what that means. So Garrison basically then, after that conversation goes off, and he ordered a full volume of the Warren Report and started reading it. And pretty much like anybody else that decides to read the Warren Report, he kept finding inconsistencies and things that didn't quite make sense in it. And more and more, the more he read it, the more he didn't buy into it, and the more he thought, you know what, there's something wrong here. We got to take another look at this. And it was at that point, towards the mid to late part of 1966, that he quietly decided to, open up a new investigation with his staff.
Right. Now, about this time, of course, you have books starting to come out. You got Mark Lane doing what he was doing back then. You had outspoken people like Vince Salandria out of Philadelphia. You had a lot of these early critics of the Warren Report, starting to surface at about the same time that Garrison was beginning his investigation. And a lot of these guys, including people like Harold Weisberg, Mark Lane, they basically volunteered their services,
right.
To help him out and give him information.
Yeah, a lot of these guys joined on. Mark Lane had actually just taken out a lease on an apartment, I believe, in New York City, and after going out and meeting with and talking with Garrison, canceled his lease immediately and went down to New Orleans to help volunteer on Garrison's staff. Part of the problem is, though, is that at first he was doing it in secret, and he didn't want any publicity for it. He wanted to just kind of do it, kind of lay low. But a reporter from the New Orleans State Item, a lady by the name of Rosemary James, started looking in and started talking to people around the French Quarter and around the city of New Orleans, and found out that Garrison's people had been coming around and talking about Oswald and talking about the assassination. And then all of a sudden, it became the front page story on the State's Item in February of 1967. So he wanted to keep it out of the press, and unfortunately, it blew up. And as soon as the front page story hit, then all of a sudden the media starts coming down there, and it becomes a huge story.
Right, and Garrison was really, I guess, particular would be the word I'd use, to when it actually came to putting Clay Shaw on trial. He was really particular about the witnesses that he wanted to use, and he didn't want to give the defense any kind of a reason, be it drug use or homosexuality or anything like that they could point a finger back and discredit his witnesses. So he was going about things the hard way, if you will.
Yes, and he was. And another part of the piece of the puzzle that Garrison read in the Warren Report is a person that he knew and went to law school with, a New Orleans lawyer named Dean Andrews, who said that the day after the assassination, he got called and asked to go to Dallas to be a lawyer for Lee Oswald as he was being questioned by the Dallas police. And he was asked, well, who called you to ask you that? And the name that he said that a man by the name of Clay Bertrand was the person that called him and asked him to go to represent Lee Oswald. So Garrison started looking around the French Quarter and looking around New Orleans to try and nail down who this Clay Bertrand was. Part of the problem is that In the years previous to the assassination, Jim Garrison had led a crackdown in the French Quarter. And, a lot of organized crime and a lot of, he'd gone after drugs, gone after prostitution, gone after organized crime. And part of the problem is a lot of the bar and saloon owners down in the French Quarter that time, they were kind of on the take, and a lot of them were in on it. And when Garrison started to shut down these illegal activities, they were losing money from it. So Garrison got reluctance from people to want to cooperate them because he had cost them some money because of his crackdown in the French Quarter. But he went around and he actually found people off the record, a couple of him, and he writes so in his book, that he found people who off the record would not testify, but off the record he would state that Clay Bertrand was the name being used by Clay Shaw, who was the director of the International Trade Mart in Dallas. Shaw was actually a well-known figure in New Orleans. Not in Dallas, but in New Orleans. Shaw was a well-known figure in New Orleans, and he was having trouble finding people who would go on the record and confirm this.
Right.
So that was part of his issue there, but he kept working at it.
Right, and part of the problem was that old Clay Shaw was leading somewhat of a double life, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Shaw was, a public profile, but Shaw, a lot of people didn't know at the time, but Shaw was a homosexual and was leading a life, in some of the bars with some of the younger men in New Orleans. And that is also apparently one of the links and one of the ways he knew David Ferry, who, of course, we talked about earlier, that apparently knew Oswald and took that trip to Texas, and who Garrison brought in for questioning right after the assassination.
Right, and it's important to not necessarily highlight it for that reason, but also to point out that, homosexuality in this case is somewhat of a theme when it comes to a lot of these major players like General Edwin Walker, Jack Ruby, Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and, several others. I mean, there was even, I think Dean Andrews, implied that Oswald was a little swishy.
Yeah. And that certainly was, but Garrison really didn't want to make that a factor or anything in the case because he didn't want it to make it seem like it was a witch hunt. So he kind of shied away from even making that any sort of connection with that because he didn't want it to be, okay, well, this guy's just persecuting him for this reason. So what happens is that, again, David Ferry comes to the forefront because of his reported association with Lee Harvey Oswald, which actually goes all the way back to the early to mid-1950s, as David Ferry was the leader of a troop in the Civil Air Patrol. And for those of you who don't know what the Civil Air Patrol is, it's kind of like, I guess it would be like the cadets, almost like an upscale version of the Boy Scouts, I think. It's kind of, I think that's how I read it. Is that right, Rob?
Yeah.
Kind of like the cadets, or?
Yeah, kind of like a pre-military,
right.
if that's what you were trying to head into back then, maybe that's what, instead of the Boy Scouts, you would try to do, like ROTC.
And you teach you, like, life skills and so on like that.
Right, the boys interested in flying.
Lee Harvey Oswald was actually a member of the troop that David Ferry was a leader of, even though David Ferry denied it at the time, but years later, in the early 1990s, there was a PBS special on the show Frontline. They had an episode called Who Was Lee Harvey Oswald? And they actually produced a picture of both David Ferry and Oswald at a Civil Air Patrol cookout.
Right, and there's even stories from other witnesses, including one of the boys. I forget his name right now. I don't think it was Ed Vogel, but it might have been. that David Ferry was actively looking for that very picture soon after Garrison started sniffing around for him.
That's right. He started calling him. He started calling all his old Civil Air Patrol contacts, trying to find that picture. Now, there's even been reports. Now, they've never been 100% confirmed, but there's been several reports that when Oswald was arrested in Dallas, he actually had on him David Ferry's library card. Now, I don't know if that's true. No one's ever really said one way or another for sure that it was or wasn't, but that's certainly something that has come up.
Right. Yeah, I know. I've heard that allegation alleged before. So when we're talking about David Ferry, you know, he was kind of reluctant to talk to Jim Garrison, though, wasn't he?
He was very reluctant to talk to him. He, at the point that the investigation went public and was in the papers and the media, it seemed like Ferry began to fear for his life because, of course, there's the report that people, witnesses in this case were starting to mysteriously vanish and mysteriously die, and it seemed like he almost started to panic, and one night, Lou Ivon, who was one of Garrison's chief investigators, gets a call at home from a frantic David Ferry, basically saying, you know what, I'm a dead man. People are after me, I'm a dead man. And so Ivon talks to Garrison, and what they do is they take Ferry to a hotel in New Orleans and basically go up and talk to him in the hotel, away from everybody. So they have a discussion with Ferry that night, and it was an off-the-record discussion, but according to Lou Ivon, Ferry confirmed that he knew Oswald, that he knew Clay Shaw, and that they had been working with the CIA along with, some of the elements of the anti-Castro-Cuban groups in New Orleans. So then they decide, okay, well, they go into deciding whether or not they're going to, whether they're going to prosecute Ferry, whether to keep him as a material witness, and then the next day he turns up dead. He leaves the hotel and turns up dead in his apartment. Right. They
did not want him to leave that hotel and go home, but he pretty much chose to do that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, like you said, he's found dead with 2 suicide notes, both typed but signed.
Neither signed.
Oh, neither one were signed. Okay.
Yeah, and it's very strange timing because it comes about 1 week after the Garrison investigation actually hit the newspapers. So that's very interesting timing, how quickly that all transpired in that time.
Yeah, and that was a big, huge blow to Jim Garrison because that right there, if David Ferry would have lived and talked, I think we'd be talking about a little bit of a different outcome, Charles.
Oh, absolutely. Ferry, I think, had a lot more information. I think he knew quite a bit, and with his death, that information went to the grave with him. So at that point, Garrison basically is kind of at a crossroads. His star witness / prime suspect is now dead. Now, they had already been looking into Clay Shaw because of the reports that he was Clay Bertrand and that he had been seen with Ferry and he had been seen with Oswald. So Garrison had to make, and I think Garrison characterized it as what he called a command decision, and made the decision to go ahead and arrest Clay Shaw and charge him with conspiring to kill President Kennedy. I don't think at that point he really wanted to arrest Shaw because he hadn't developed a strong enough case with him. But I think Garrison started to believe that if he had waited any longer on Shaw, he might be the next one to turn up missing.
Yep. And looking back now, I don't think it was any sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Happy accident that Oswald was seen handing leaflets out in front of the trademark, which Clay Shaw was in charge of. And And even in one of the videos that we have from the news crew that was videotaping him, we have what appears to be Clay Shaw seen walking in the background into the building. Now,
yeah,
you know, if Clay Shaw was you know, he was the head of the Trade Mart, and if he's walking by his building and sees some asshole out in front of it and you know, handing out pro-Castro leaflets, I would think
you'd want to get rid of them pretty quickly.
Yeah, you know, you'd think he'd want to put a stop to it.
Yeah, he probably would have walked up and said, "I don't want you here. You know, move on, go somewhere else." But there he was, Oswald, basically untouched, handing out the leaflets right in front of the International Trade Mart. So,
yep. Which tells you a little something that, you know, maybe he had an inkling of an idea of what Oswald was doing out there.
Right. Yeah. So anyways, Shaw's arrested, and right after Shaw's arrest, the national media put a real mean-spirited blitz on Garrison, the likes of which I don't think has ever been seen before or since. It just kind of erupted into a firestorm. The media really kicked it into high gear with their efforts to discredit Garrison and try and make him look like a liar, trying to make him look like he was basically on a witch hunt, trying to make it look like he had arrested an innocent man. But Garrison's belief is that Shaw was a operator, maybe not a full-fledged agent, but at least a contract agent for the CIA. And he was trying to, develop some evidence regarding that.
Right.
And at the time of the investigation, he had some trouble doing that because the CIA were being very tight-lipped. They weren't going to cooperate with Garrison.
No.
But in the years since, and with the establishment of the AARB, a lot of documents and information has come out indicating that Shaw did have a working relationship with CIA.
Yeah, voila. And if Garrison would have had anything like that back then, again, we might have had a different outcome on things.
Right. If nothing else, we would have probably at least had some more information.
Exactly.
So, there's a couple of real interesting documents, though, relating to Shaw. Well, first of all, in early September, the CIA convened what they called the Garrison Group, which was a group of CIA, personnel that were basically monitoring the situation in New Orleans. And there's actually one document here that was released in 1998. And it was the topic was the first meeting of the Garrison Group, where they kind of went over, the agency's interest in Garrison. You gotta ask yourself, if Clay Shaw had no interest and no relationship with the CIA, then why is the CIA even interested in the Garrison case? Exactly. Why did they gotta go to the point of establishing a Garrison Group?
Yeah.
If they had nothing to worry about, what did they care? But right in this document here, it says that the executive director said the director had asked him to convene a group to consider the possible implications for the agency emanating from New Orleans before, during, and after the trial of Clay Shaw. So what implications could it be then?
Right, they were afraid of something coming out.
They were obviously concerned with the Garrison investigation because they wouldn't go to all this trouble to have a special group if they didn't have some concerns.
No, and we also now have evidence of Garrison's investigative team, his district attorney team, being infiltrated by CIA assets and other folks looking to disrupt things and steal files and copy files.
Oh, sure. Yeah, Garrison tells a story in a documentary of how he had a man that came on who was very enthusiastically wanting to help out with the investigation and volunteers. So Garrison brought him on. And Garrison always thought it was a little strange because when the guy showed up for work, he was always carrying this big, large briefcase. And he always wondered why this guy needed such a large briefcase. Then he realized because he was taking files with him when he left.
Right. You know.
And it was funny because Garrison and his men said that over half of their documents and half of their briefs and info that they had got turned over to the defense. And Garrison even stated by the end that that the defense team had more files than they did when the case started.
I believe it. You know, which again lends credence to the why would the CIA care so much?
Well, this could be one of the reasons. In that same document about the first Garrison meeting, there's a member of the CIA staff named Raymond Roca, who they asked to just kind of do a preliminary look into the case that Garrison had against Shaw. And Roca wrote up a report that stated that he felt that Garrison would obtain a conviction of Clay Shaw for conspiring to assassinate President Kennedy. So at that point, I think alarm bells start going off.
Oh yeah, and they really started bringing.
If he does obtain a conviction, then what else does that open the door to?
Exactly.
That they didn't want people to know.
Right, and I imagine the sudden emergence of one Perry Raymond Russo got them even more ruffled.
Oh, absolutely. So maybe just going quickly about Perry Russo's story. And Perry Russo was a New Orleans insurance agent. And he was a friend of David Ferry's, and Ferry invited him to a party he was having at that night. This was in the summer of 1963. And Russo attended the party. He said that, there was probably about a dozen other people there. There were some Cubans and a couple other people of interest there. One guy that he got introduced to, who he described as a large, white-haired man by the name of Clay Bertrand. And if you know anything about Clay Shaw, he was a large, white-haired man.
Right.
The other guy Russo got introduced to was a guy that was introduced to him by Ferry as Leon Oswald.
Mm-hmm.
And they were at this party and they had been drinking heavily, and then, Ferry got really drunk and started, ranting about Castro. He started ranting about Kennedy, and then he said that Shaw, or who he later identified as Shaw, who, of course, was introduced to him as Bertrand, Ferry and Oswald started talking about plans or possibilities for killing Kennedy. And then basically killing Kennedy and blaming it on Castro.
Right.
Because Ferry was very much involved with the anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans. And apparently also in the training camp that the CIA was running up north of New Orleans at Lake Pontchartrain, where they were training large groups of Cuban exiles for hopefully another invasion of Cuba. And Ferry was apparently involved with that.
Right. The problem being about Leon Oswald, though, is Russo described him as somewhat of a brash, dirty, unshaven, scraggly dick, basically.
Yeah.
Which, looking into the history of Oswald, there's no indication that he ever didn't shave we have, of course, allegations that he was a dick sometimes.
Yeah.
But never that he was unkempt or dirty,
True. But personally, I'm not thinking that whether it was or was Oswald, I think the more important fact is that they used that name in particular, Leon.
Right. And of course, that's not the first time that the name Leon pops up in the case either.
Well, the other interesting connection to that is also the name used by the two Cubans who showed up on the doorstep of Sylvia Odio in September, talking about, the Cuban exiles and wanting to join up with the DURE, which was the Democratic, what does it stand for? Drawing a blank.
Friends of
Anyways, they showed up at her doorstep and with this guy who was apparently, they gave him the name Leon Oswald and talked to Sylvia Odio for a while, and then a day later, one of the Cubans calls Sylvia Odio back and says that this Leon Oswald is a psycho, and he thinks that the Cubans should have killed Kennedy. And I've always thought that that was one of the most interesting happenstances in the case, because to me that seemed very much like a setup for a story that would be told later, and basically implicating Oswald as this psycho that wanted to get Kennedy, even though most of the other evidence that we know about Oswald tends to point in the opposite direction.
Right, and we even have Lawrence Howard, I think in 1965, to the FBI admitting that it was him and Lauren Hall that went to see Sylvia Odio, and then he later recanted.
Yeah.
Probably under threat from Lauren Hall.
Yes, probably true.
But, so to swing it back to New Orleans a little bit, and to get back to Perry Russo, of course, they tried to discredit him, but one important thing that I'd like everybody to take into consideration is the fact that until his dying day, Perry Russo never changed his story.
No. And he told it in numerous TV interviews, he told it on documentaries, and his story was always the same, and he always maintained that the guy introduced to him as Clay Bertrand was Clay Shaw, and he was absolutely adamant about that, and never once changed his story.
Right, but it wasn't enough, I guess, for the jury to buy to actually convict Clay Shaw.
Well, part of the problem is that Garrison's case it took 2 years, almost, from the time Shaw was arrested till the time the trial started. And the media was hammering him almost for the entire 2 years. There were horrible articles written about him, and of course, one of the best-known cases of that is the 1-hour NBC special, which was entitled "The JFK Conspiracy: The Case of Jim Garrison."
Yeah, they tracked.
And basically, on that, you would have thought by the title, "Oh, okay, well, they're going to tell us about it and gives us information." The whole thing was an hour-long smear job, or as I call it, a hit piece on Garrison. It wasn't in the least bit impartial.
No.
It was basically people saying that Garrison was drugging witnesses, which is a real stretch. Now, Garrison has admitted that he did give what's called sodium pentothal, truth theorem,
right,
to witnesses, and Garrison has not denied that or anything like that. And to be honest, that's something that is done by many, police officers.
Yeah, at least back then.
Because one of the things it does is it relaxes a person, and sometimes when they're relaxed, they will come out with more details. They're not as much anxiety. They talk about how he drugged witnesses, how he was buying witnesses off, and how he was using non-reputable witnesses. One of the ones they point to is a guy by the name of Vernon Bundy, who was a admitted narcotics user. And they try and say, well, he was a narcotics user, so we should question the reliability of his testimony because he was a drug user. And then one of the guys they used to help discredit his story was a guy by the name of John Chanclier, who was a convict, a convicted burglar, who was in jail, was a cellmate of Vernon Bundy, and guess who put him in jail? Jim Garrison.
Yeah.
So, are we really to believe that this guy didn't have a bit of an axe to grind against the guy that helped put him in jail?
Exactly.
And another guy that NBC used in this hit piece, a guy by the name of Miguel Torres, another convict, who said that the DA's office, the Garrison's office, was trying to bribe him with early release if he told stories about Clay Shaw. And what do we find? Miguel Torres was put in jail, again by Jim Garrison. So we're supposed to believe that this guy is a drug user, he's not a valid witness because he's a drug user. These other two convicts who have also broken the law and who were convicted by Garrison, yet we're supposed to believe them word for word.
Exactly. But
it just is ridiculous.
Yeah. But Charles, one good thing did come out of that special. To tell everybody what Jim Garrison actually got to do that I don't think I've ever seen on television ever before, and I don't think we'll ever see it again.
Well, after the special aired, Garrison went off and he said, you know what, this isn't fair. You guys have said all this stuff about me. I'd like equal time on your network to give my side of the story. Now, they didn't exactly give equal time, but they did give him an unedited half an hour on NBC where he was able to go and talk to the American people directly and start telling them about why, the JFK case has to be looked at, and that, the Warren Commission is fiction, and you know what, give me, look into this, and he started giving reasons why, this has got to be looked at more.
Right.
And it actually resonated quite a bit, because he got quite a bit of support after that, because he was able to, basically, without any interference from any outside help, he was able to give his story directly to the people.
Yeah, and he specifically
called
out.
I've never seen any, like you said, never seen that after, and probably never see that again, where someone like that is going to be given, full carte blanche, basically, on a major network to at least give their side and obstructed by any other, outside source.
Right, and I also read somewhere that after that happened, they did away with that rule or that law or whatever it was that guaranteed them equal time. So.
Yep.
But he also.
And also shortly after that, then Johnny Carson.
Oh yeah.
Came into the mix and also had Jim Garrison on The Tonight Show. I believe it was in late January of 1968. In fact, you can go on YouTube. You can actually hear the full interview with Jim Garrison and Johnny Carson. Now, one of the things I noted when I was listening to that, and I was always a big fan of Johnny Carson. I always enjoyed his show. I thought he was a great entertainer. But one of the things I had never seen before that I saw when Johnny Carson was interviewing Jim Garrison is just how hostile Carson seemed to be towards Garrison. Garrison was trying to bring out, points of why he felt the Warren Commission got it wrong. But Carson was always saying, well, that's your opinion. Well, that's not a fact. Well, that's that, that's this. And instead of, being impartial and just kind of going with it and letting the viewer decide, it almost seemed like he was told, don't let this guy get away with anything. Challenge this guy.
Yeah, make a fool out of it.
I don't know. I've never seen it like that from Johnny Carson before.
No, and we never saw it again after, I don't think.
No. Johnny Carson's always the type of guy, he's out there joking with his guests, having fun, but he was very serious and very, like I said, he seemed very hostile to him. Now, I don't know whether that was his own feeling or whether someone asked him to do that, but I don't know.
I'm sure he was told to do that, which gives you a little window into the extent and the power of the, who Garrison was implicating in the death of JFK, the CIA.
Oh yeah, and he mentioned that he was very much open up front with that.
Oh, most definitely.
So he didn't seem to hide that, and the half an hour special that NBC gave Garrison, he was very upfront with there that he thought it was a CIA operation, and he made no bones about that. And the CIA, obviously, by the fact that they're convening a Garrison group, they were worried about it.
Well, yeah. And
I think
out there,
part of the reason may be that Clay Shaw did, in fact, have some sort of working relationship with the CIA, and there's some evidence to back that up.
Right.
One of the things that I found out when looking into this is there is a project that the CIA was working on, and the project is called QK Enchant.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a secret one, and to this day, we still do not know the full details of what that operation was, in fact, that operation had to do with. But there was a document released in 1999. It was a CIA internal memo again. And the subject of the memo was a man named J. Monroe Sullivan. J. Monroe Sullivan was the director of the International Trade Mart in San Francisco. So basically, he held the same position that Clay Shaw held in New Orleans.
Right.
So it discusses how this J. Monroe Sullivan had received CIA security clearance for this project QK Enchant. It also then goes on to mention that Clay Shaw also had received CIA security clearance for this project, and not only that he had been given clearance, it even gives his number, his what they call the security clearance number. And this is supposedly Clay Shaw, who said he had no connection to the CIA, yet he's been given CIA security clearance for an operation that we don't even know to this day what it had to do with. And then we come to find out later, another interesting person had been given clearance for this project as well. Howard Hunt.
Yep.
Who has been linked to the JFK case up and down for years. So that's an interesting little connection. And another interesting connection is that Clay Shaw, on the day of the assassination, was on a business trip in San Francisco where he was with J. Monroe Sullivan,
right,
who had also been given clearance for this CIA project.
And to which he...
so that's an interesting connection there.
Yeah, and I think Perry Russo also said that in the meeting that Clay Shaw said that he would be out of town as part of the plan of the assassination.
That's right, that he'd go out of town, and I believe even mentioned to the West Coast.
Yeah, specifically.
Which, of course, is where San Francisco is.
Most definitely.
So, you get all these interesting tidbits as far as Clay Shaw's ties to the CIA. Now, back in World War II, Shaw was allegedly a medic in the CIA, but there has also been a lot of people that said that Shaw was not really a medic in the CIA, that in fact that he was actually, during World War II, working for the OSS.
Right.
Which was the preliminary, precursor to the CIA. They were responsible for intelligence gathering a lot during the Second World War. And another interesting tidbit, which I found out when researching a recent article that I wrote, is that Shaw's military record is classified. What do you got to classify a record of a medic for? If he's a simple medic, what do they need to classify it for?
Exactly.
It just doesn't make any sense. So you found all these little tidbits of Shaw's connection to the CIA, not to mention the least of which Richard Helms in the late 1970s, admitting under oath that Shaw had been a contact of the CIA's domestic contact division. So we go from Shaw not having any connection to the CIA and instead we've got all of these different little tidbits showing that he did have a relationship with the CIA. And of course, a lot of this stuff wasn't noted by Garrison. He didn't know about it because, again, anytime he went to the CIA and asked them for information, the CIA would stonewall him. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
I wonder why that is.
Yeah, I think if he would have had a lot of this information back then, it would have been a different story. I think if David Ferrie would have lived and talked, it would have been a different story. I think if Guy Bannister would have lived and talked, it might have been a different story.
Well, Bannister's a guy we haven't even touched on yet. And he, I think, was up to this thing up to his eyeballs. And because he's a link there as well between Shaw or not between Shaw, but between Ferrie and Oswald. Of course, as you may know, Oswald was running an office at 544 Camp Street.
Yeah.
Which, of course, was the same building that housed Guy Bannister's offices. And you got to think of this. Apparently, Guy Bannister was a rabid anti-communist.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't seem to me like to be the kind of guy that if a communist sympathizer was running an office in the same building where his office was, I'm guessing he wasn't going to be the type of guy that actually stood for that.
No.
And then there's, of course, the famous incident that Jack Martin told Garrison about where Bannister's secretary, Delphine Roberts, comes into Bannister's office while the two of them are sitting there and shows Bannister one of the leaflets that Oswald was passing out, the pro-Castro leaflets. And Bannister just kind of chuckled and said, "It's okay, he's with us."
Right. But Delphine Roberts, she didn't talk to. She didn't, I guess, open up to Garrison, did she? I mean, that was only later. I think to Anthony.
No, that was later. That was a story that I believe Jack Martin had actually told Garrison.
Okay.
But Delphine Roberts never actually talked till much, much later. Garrison couldn't get her to talk.
And of course,
and that was another thing, is that a lot of witnesses wouldn't cooperate with Garrison for several different reasons.
Right, one of them being...
So they go to trial with Clay Shaw, and the trial, once again, Garrison gets another little surprise during his trial, where things actually, if you look at it, were going not too badly for Garrison. Some of his early witnesses were making some good headway. And then Garrison put on the stand a guy named Charles Speisel. And by the way, the name is not, that's souring my name, but anyways, that's neither here nor there. So Charles Speisel was an accountant from New York City. And he, at first, sounded like he would have been a slam-dunk gold star witness, because he testified that he met Shaw and Ferrie in a hotel while on a business trip to New Orleans. And again, much like Perry Russo, he said that Ferrie and Shaw had discussed a plot to kill Kennedy. So, again, that would have been a bombshell announcement. But then the defense got up and started questioning him. And then he started saying how he was being followed by the government, and that he had been put under hypnosis by the government. I think he said at least a dozen times. And then he went on and said that he had actually fingerprinted his daughter before and after she went to college to make sure that the government had not substituted a double. In other words, he sounded like a crazy man.
Right.
And that really hurt Garrison's credibility with the jury, because this witness that they put on, who magically came and fell in Garrison's lap, I believe a week before they put him on the stand, and then he goes on and tells this whopper of a story, and Garrison and his men felt that he may have actually been a plant sent there to sabotage him.
Yeah, I think Garrison got catfished there.
It's very possible.
Unbelievable. So let's get, I guess, more towards the end. Losing that conviction to Shaw really hurt Garrison. and I don't mean professionally. I mean, he went on to be a judge and all that. I just mean I guess it was a blow to his ego, and it showed him that those in power are still in power.
Oh, absolutely. Garrison knew what he was up against. Garrison knew that he knew right from the outset that getting a conviction against Shaw was a massive long shot. He knew that when he arrested him, and he even knew it even more by the time it went to trial. But, for him, it was more about the ends justifying the means. I think by the end, it became more of getting the information into a public record, into transcripts, and getting them out for public consumption. Because I think he really felt that Garrison that, you know what, I'm fighting, the big government, and they're going to win, but at least I can somewhat strike a blow against them, and maybe convince some other people. Because you would have thought that after the Shaw acquittal, he would have, backed off and kind of, stopped talking about the Kennedy case. But right up until the day he died, he was out there, he was traveling around, giving lectures. I think he wrote 3 books. He was a consultant for Oliver Stone. He really, he knew that, what did he say? That the government knows that they have been danced with, I think, because if you ever know the people in New Orleans, they talk, with the interesting language. He said that they knew that they had been danced with, because he was the only public official to this date to actually try and take them on and try and expose them for the Kennedy assassination.
Right, or to even try to take it to trial, because people got to remember that this is still an open murder case in Dallas, Texas. And
that's right, because there's never been a conviction of anybody in this case.
Right.
So with that, it still has to be considered a cold case, an open case, because Oswald obviously never convicted because Ruby took care of that, and it's still really an open case. I mean, I'm sure the government will tell you, oh, no, the case is closed, Oswald did it, we've got it, but it's not a closed case, and that's why there's so many people out there, in the writing books. There's people out there on Facebook debating it every day. There's people writing articles, and it's not just American people. There are so many great other researchers out there, not just from the U.S., although there are a lot in the U.S., but of course you talk about some of the other ones. You had Greg Parker on just recently from Australia. Another friend of mine, Trish Fleming, who's a fellow Canadian. You've got another gentleman from, you got Leno Sanek. I'm sure you know Leno Sanek, who is also Canadian and here from BC, who does a podcast as well, Black Op Radio. And you've got so many other people from, U.S. You've got people from England. There's the Daily Plaza UK site. So it's all over the world, and people still have an interest in this case, and people will probably always still have an interest in this case until we ever do find out exactly what happened.
Yeah, and it blows my mind still to this day that, people not only here but worldwide, have taken it upon themselves to be interested enough in the case to actively research it and, continue to write books and continue to do great things and continue to stay in the loop. It's hard enough to do to actually stay interested with things going on in your own country, let alone things going on outside of your country. But I think the ramifications felt from Kennedy's assassination were felt worldwide, not just here. I mean, we're still...
Oh, it was.
Yeah, we're still living with the ripple effects now, with all these, continuing wars all throughout the world, and spreading the freedom, throughout the world that we continue to do. And, it's just, one thing I wanted to touch back on, Charles, before we wrap up here is, a lot of people tend to dismiss the whole New Orleans part of this case because on the surface, it's really hard to make a connection between New Orleans and what was going on there and what happened in Dallas. And that's the gray area, I think, for most people, to make that giant leap from what the hell was going on in New Orleans to what happened a couple months later in Dallas. And, it's hard to make the connections between, Jack Ruby and Lee Oswald and, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, and maybe who was calling the shots. And, it's very, very hard to make that connection,
Well, I think a large part of the whole New Orleans thing was Oswald being in New Orleans in the summer of '63. I believe that was kind of at the beginning stages of the plot, because I think the whole purpose of the New Orleans thing was to try and give Oswald a more public identity. If you look before the summer of 1963, Oswald was not out there, he wasn't handing stuff out, he wasn't going on radio interviews, he wasn't doing anything like that. He gets to New Orleans in 1963, and what does he start doing? He's out on the street handing out leaflets. He's getting into altercations with anti-Castro Cubans, which I think was a staged event. I think that was planned to happen.
Oh, yeah.
Then he's going on radio shows and talking about his Marxism. Then he did a television interview. In that summer, he begins the process of giving himself not just a higher profile, but a higher profile as a Castro Marxist supporter.
Right.
And I think that guys like Ferry and Shaw in New Orleans, their purpose at that point was to get Oswald out there and get him seen by as many people as possible. You mentioned the fact of Oswald handing out leaflets in front of the International Trade Mart. Then, of course, we have the famous story of Oswald going with Shaw and Ferry up to the Clinton-Jackson location up not far from New Orleans. And that is to, I think, get him out in front of people, get him out of the profile. We have him lining up for a voter registration. Well, he didn't live in Louisiana. Well, he lived in Louisiana, but why is he needing to go to a voter registration? Well, because he then showed up at the mental hospital in Jackson trying to obtain a job. And again, it's getting him out there. It's getting him out there seen by people. And then I know Jim DiEugenio, who's the head of the CTKA, believed that the purpose of the Clinton-Jackson trip, or one of the main purposes, was to get him to go to the Louisiana State Hospital and have him fill out an application form as if he were applying for the job. And Jim DiEugenio believes that after that, that job application was going to be taken out and actually put in as a patient application to make him look like he's got mental problems, right, as part of this setup as for him down the road to be a patsy. And the Clinton-Jackson incident is well documented. There was at least half a dozen witnesses that testified at Shaw's trial to this trip that identified Ferry, Shaw, and Oswald. They testified at the Shaw trial. Then they go on and they testified at the HSCA. And the HSCA, in their report, found that all of the Clinton witnesses were credible. They believed that the Clinton witnesses were telling the truth and had established a relationship between Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald 3 months before the assassination. And then, of course, you have him in New Orleans handing out leaflets, promoting Castro. Then there's the incident, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, with Carlos Brinier, where they got into a scuffle, an altercation on the streets. And here's another interesting part that I've always found strange. They have this big altercation. They get into this quote-unquote fight on the sidewalk. Carlos Brinier basically walks away scot-free, despite the fact that all the witnesses said that he started the incident and he was the more aggressive of the two parties during the incident.
Right.
But yet Oswald spends the night in jail. So one guy walks free, one guy spends the night in jail, and then what does Oswald do? He has to speak to the FBI.
Yeah, he said, tell him you got to
I don't think he's talking to the FBI about an altercation he's fighting in the side of a street corner. He talks to the FBI, and the notes from the FBI interview, surprise, surprise, get destroyed.
Yep.
So we don't know what they talked about. So something was going on in New Orleans, and the whole point, I think, of the whole New Orleans situation was to give Oswald a higher profile. And it may not even have been 100% for sure for the assassination to begin with. It might have been for some type of operation that the CIA was setting up down the road, but somebody wanted Oswald to be seen and by as many people as he could, and to have a higher profile, and to have that profile show him off as a communist sympathizer.
Right.
So I think that's a large part of what the New Orleans side of the case was. I think that the guys like Ferry and Shaw, they were just, being asked by people above them, to do all these things. They were just being asked to do this. They may not have even been told right off the bat what they were told to do it for. But they just say, you know what, we want you, there's this guy here in New Orleans, we want you to do this with him, we want you to take him here, we want you to let him do this, and let's get him out there and let's have people see what he's doing.
Yeah, and I think Bannister was a big part of that. He was an avid communist hunter. And reporting back to the FBI, getting people on these lists, getting students from Tulane on the list, getting returning servicemen on the list. Much like McCarthy was doing, he was
right.
He was out hunting for communists. And that's what, Charles, I think that's what a lot of this stems from in New Orleans, is this anti-communist sentiment.
Oh, absolutely. And I think Bannister was one of the chief operators, may have been the top guy in New Orleans. I think he was the guy that was probably overseeing all of this.
Right. And
he was the guy, and he was obviously, he had ties to the FBI, and he obviously, I think, was probably, in connection with the CIA. He had been involved in the ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, so he's the guy to keep an eye on everything. He was the guy that was kind of the watchman, if you will.
Right.
And if you remember that that famous 1960 memo written by Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, saying that someone was using Lee Harvey Oswald's names to buy trucks. And the group that was doing this was called the Friends of Democratic Cuba. Well, Guy Bannister was on the board of directors for the Friends of Democratic Cuba.
Exactly.
So it starts tying in back then.
Yep, and even if this wasn't a CIA operation straight from the top down, even if it was this group of guys who had these anti-Castro ties, who might have had anti-Kennedy sentiment because of his softness on communism and his unwillingness to do anything about Cuba.
Right.
Even if they... What kind of makes sense to me is if it wasn't like a total agency plot, even if it was just this group of guys, they got together, Shaw and Ferry and a couple other people, and decided that Kennedy had to go because of his soft stance on communism and his unwillingness to do anything about Cuba and his unwillingness to back these anti-Castro Cubans and get Castro out of power or to do anything, that they were going to, with what they were doing in Cuba with these freedom fighters, they weren't really getting anywhere doing that. So what other option did they have other than to turn the guns on Kennedy? You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. I've never thought that it was a full agency right from the very top. I think it was a plan by, groups of guys, Cuban exiles, and agents of the CIA, guys that were likely involved with the Bay of Pigs. Because a lot of those guys felt betrayed, and a lot of those guys felt double-crossed by Kennedy because Kennedy wouldn't provide any support for them at the Bay of Pigs. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis hits in 1962, and these guys are finally thinking, okay, well, Kennedy's finally going to go in. He's finally going to get rid of Castro. He's finally going to get rid of all that that communist from Cuba. Kennedy decides not to invade in 1962, cuts a deal with the Soviet Union not to invade Cuba so that the Soviet Union will remove the missiles. And again, that sets them off even more because, once again, they said they're going to get rid of Castro, and they don't. So then you got this group just kind of spinning out there in the winds. They start this training camp up near Lake Pontchartrain, and again, Kennedy shuts the camp down. So at that point, they're thinking, okay, we want to get rid of Castro, but we're not going to be able to unless we get rid of Kennedy. And they figured that's where we have to go with this. And then I think that you've got this group of guys, and I think guys, guys like Howard Hunt, guys like David Phillips, guys that were involved in this anti-Castro efforts by the CIA, basically got together, plotted this out to kill Kennedy, and then I think the hierarchy in the CIA probably got wind of this, or probably told this, and basically have to just cover up because it was their guys that were involved in doing it, and if it ever got out, it would destroy the CIA, so they got to just basically keep it shut and make sure nothing comes out, and this is why you're seeing in these meetings the concern, like this one document says, that basically they have to consider the possible implications for the agency emanating from Clay Shaw's trial.
Right, like you were alluding
because
to before.
If he gets convicted and if all this information comes out, it could destroy their agency.
Yeah, and like you were alluding to before, I think we get the lone nut narrative thanks to cooler heads prevailing, when it comes to, pinning this on Oswald, but instead of pinning it on pro-Castro Oswald with ties, to supporting Cuba and being a former Soviet resident, a former traitor to the States and defecting to the Soviet Russia, where I think if more of those ties were brought out back then, and, a lot of people would have been screaming to go to war. A lot of people would have been screaming for Castro's head, for us to do something. And
right,
people were scared. It was the nuclear age, and people were scared. It was going to lead to World War III. So, hence we get the crazy lone nut assassin with no ties to anybody, just this crazy guy, who got a wild hair up his ass one day and decided to kill the president.
Yes, because if you'll notice the narrative on the day of the assassination, in the media, when they're doing the reports, they brought up quite often that he was, connected to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and it started out. But more and more, as we got farther away from the actual event, his ties to Cuba and Castro and the communism, they just seemed to slowly disappear, and more, he just became some malcontent lone nut that was just pissed off at the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Charles, I think we pretty much covered everything here. Is there anything you wanted to touch on that we did not get into here about New Orleans and the Garrison investigation?
I think we've covered basically everything. I think we covered it pretty good there.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, I'm sure we could probably talk about this for hours, man. But
one thing I will just bring up is we were talking about earlier about the government and the media kind of attacks against Garrison, the way they really went after Garrison and gave him no credit and tried to discredit him. Well, in a document that came out in 1998, basically the CIA put out a document basically in dealing with critics of the Warren Commission for their people if they get into a conversation conversation or anything with people in the Warren Commission how to, refute that. And one of the things they mention is using friendly media assets to basically support the Warren Commission and support the official story. Well, that seems to be what they did to Jim Garrison, because you got a lot of these media assets out there, and it was universally right across the board. New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, CBS, just going after Garrison, and it seemed to be right from the talking points laid out in this CIA document. So I guess their plan seemed to work pretty well.
Yeah, and label us all as conspiracy theorists,
Yes, conspiracy theorists. Conspiracy theorists.
Crazy folks.
Yeah, nut jobs with their tinfoil hats, watching, looking out their windows for UFO and alien spaceships.
Yeah.
Yeah, always say, take off your tinfoil hat. That's another thing they do, is they always try and say, you're just into the JF conspiracy, you probably believe in aliens and Elvis being alive, blah, blah. It's nothing like that. They're different completely.
Right, and hopefully here in a couple weeks, Charles, we're going to get into the brain of one of these, Warren Commission apologists, lone nutters, and who's agreed to come on the show, and we're going to have a nice, civilized conversation about exactly why they believe what they believe.
Yeah.
And which should be interesting.
Well, and that's what you got to. Yeah, and that's what you got to do when you're talking to a guy who is a lone nutter supporter. You've got to talk to him in a calm, rational. Don't let the emotions get up you, because a lot of people not like what they say. But the problem is, if you let emotions get into it and you start going off the rails, that just hurts your purpose more than it helps.
Right, and of course they're not all the same, just like we're not all the same.
Yeah, you got a lot of people on the conspiracy side too that, I don't have the time of day for a lot of them.
Yeah, I know. And
Miss Baker.
Yeah.
Anyways, speaking of the Garrison case, there's someone that kind of put herself right in the middle of it, didn't she? Interesting.
Yeah.
But I don't want to go out about her. She's not worth the time.
Exactly. I mean, if Jim Garrison back, this is a point I like to point out a lot too. If Jim Garrison, with all his contacts, with all his informants back then, did not turn this woman up, not even slightly.
Yeah.
Then,
exactly.
You know what? I'm going to discount it.
Yeah, exactly. I've said that to some of her supporters too. They just said, this and this and that. I'm like, yeah, right.
He would have turned her up if she existed.
Of course he would have.
Yeah. But I guess that'll do it for this week, Charles. I appreciate you coming on and talking with me about this.
Well, I enjoyed it, and anytime you want to do it anytime, I'd be happy to do it with you, so.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd love to have you back here in the near future.
Yeah.
Stick on the line with me here, Charles.
All right.
And that's it for today, people. This sumbitch is in the can, beamed up to the satellite, down directly to your ears. This is Rob Clark thanking my special guest, Charles Cliff, for being on the show. Y'all stay tuned next week for a special Lone Nutter guest. Peace.